So the third part of Activate, as you may remember from the very first module in the webinar, are tests of executive cognitive function. These are the tests that we use to collect the data that I showed you in the research slides. These are the tests that we then make the results available to you so that you can use that information about each child. Now, I mentioned earlier that these assessments, that you aren't able to get assessments, cognitive assessments, on all the children in your class, and on many that you might wish to have that because they're so costly. And so these Activate assessments, instead of costing $3,000 or even more per child for a professional assessment by a psychologist, for example, in their office, these come built into our program, and the reports are made available to you. And any time, for any reason, you might want to repeat the assessments, you can go to our testing site and repeat them at no extra cost. And then we provide these reports for you. Now, when I was first doing this, I thought, oh gosh, I wish I could bring all the kids into the lab one by one, because that's the way I had done research at Yale for many years, bringing each of the participants in our research projects in one by one into a quiet testing room. We were very careful about the environment, and we had one-on-one assessment. And then I thought, wow, you get a very different assessment score if you bring a young child into a quiet office, sitting one-on-one next to an adult, helping them focus and do the tests. You get a very different assessment than if you assess them in the classroom environment where they have to learn. So suddenly, our classroom-based assessments had an added ecological value. So that's what you get. Now, there are 4 tests of executive function. One is a flanker test of attention. And you see that illustrated on the top row here. This is one of the tests in the NIH toolbox of executive cognitive function tests. The NIH constituted a panel of experts recognizing how important it is to be able to measure executive cognitive function in children and actually throughout the lifespan. They constituted a panel of experts to create a toolbox of what they thought were the best tests of executive cognitive function. We at C8 were maybe even some of the first, if not the very first people to make these toolbox tests web-based, and now we have one of the largest databases in the world on the NIH tests of executive function. We've given 60,000 or more of these assessments, and when we compare your children's scores to other children of the same age, we have a reference group of 1,000 children or more for each age that we compare each of your children to give you a percentile score on their executive function tests. So this first test from the toolbox, the flanker test of attention, you can see on the top 5 arrows all pointing to the right. The task the child has is simply to say what direction is the middle arrow pointing. And they do that by pushing the right or left arrow key on the keyboard. So if that middle arrow is pointing to the right, they push the right arrow key, and pointing to the left arrow key. Now, on easy trials in this test, all of the arrows are pointing in the same direction. Those are called congruent trials. The flankers on the side are pointing in the same direction as the middle arrow. But look below that. There are trials called incongruent ones, where the middle arrow that you're supposed to pay attention to is pointing in the opposite direction from the flankers. People are distracted by that additional information from the flankers pointing in the wrong direction. People make more mistakes, and everybody, you, me, everybody, is slower in their response time on these incongruent trials. So that's the flanker test. The second test, also from the NIH toolbox, is a working memory test. It actually happens to be, in my opinion, a very difficult one, but it is the official one from the toolbox. So children are shown pictures of animals. Here is an illustration of 4 different animals. They have to remember what animals they were shown, and then they have to repeat back by tapping the animals on a big array of animals, tapping the ones that they saw. But working memory has two parts. One part is just remembering items. The other part we call the workspace of the mind, where you actually use and manipulate information. So this working memory test, for example, requires you to remember the animals you saw, but when you respond, you don't respond in the order in which you saw them. You have to reorder them in your mind to from smallest to largest. So for example, if I was shown a dog, a bird, and a rabbit, I'd have to remember those, but when the response came, I'd have to resort them. So I would respond bird, rabbit, dog, from smallest to largest. For variety in the test, sometimes you see animals and sometimes you see household items, a bed, a table, a chair, a phone, a spoon. Again, you have to remember what you saw and you have to go from smallest to largest. We show you just two to start with to make sure you understand the idea of sorting them from smallest to largest. And then if you get two right, if you can do two correctly, we show you three. If you get three right, we'll show you four. And it keeps building up to be longer and longer, and that's how we measure your working memory. Now the second part of this test is even trickier. A student will be shown a picture of an animal, a picture of a household item, a picture of an animal, a picture of a household item, and then they have to tell us what animals did they see from smallest to largest. So while they're remembering the animals and ordering them in their mind, smallest to largest, bird, rabbit, dog, they also have to keep in mind the furniture and be prepared to reorder that before they respond. This is a hard test. The last two tests measure aspects of executive function that are actually not part of the toolbox, but are widely used tests by researchers and clinicians to evaluate executive function. One of them is a test of self-control. And as you know, self-control is one of the powerful predictors of academic success and later life success. So I thought it was very important to include a measure of self-control or inhibition. And that test is called the go, no-go test. So in the first part of the test, you're told every time you see the letter P, push the space bar as fast as you can. And most of the time, we show them Ps. But when they see the letter R, they're told, don't respond. Inhibit your response. So there'll be P, 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 R, and you have to inhibit your response. After 1/3 of the test, we switch it around and we tell them when you see an R, you have to push. And when you see a P, inhibit. That leads to more mistakes by everybody. In the last part of the test, we show them household items, picture of a phone again, a chair, a table. When you see these, you have to push go, push the space bar. We also show them items of food that we think they would like to eat, ice cream, hamburgers, cake, and if they see those, they have to inhibit their responses. It turns out that that didn't make it any harder for most of the kids, but it is harder when they have to switch in the middle between the P's and R's. So this is a test of self-control, and most kids are able to inhibit themselves anywhere from 30 to 60% of the times. So especially with the younger elementary school children, they make many errors in inhibition. So that means the test is sensitive and can measure differences between children and can measure improvement when it takes place. The last test is our version of the balloon analog risk-taking test. Now this is a different type of executive function test. In this test, the standard one for adults, you see a balloon on the screen, you push the space bar, it gets bigger. Push it again, it gets bigger. You keep blowing up the balloon by pushing the space bar. You can stop whenever you want to. And when you stop, you get the number of points based on how big you made the balloon. The problem is that sometimes it pops. And it pops at random numbers of pushes to make it bigger. And if it pops, you get 0 points. So it's called a risk-taking test. How far are you going to go blowing up that balloon before you stop and cash in your points? We made a slight variation, as you can see on the picture here, where the monkey's blowing up a bubble instead of a balloon. Now, we've been collecting data on this test for 3 years, just to tell you how we work. We wanted to get enough data so that we could understand the test before we made any recommendations back to schools on the basis of this test. So we waited till we had data on about 10,000 children, and by far the biggest data set in the world on this particular test. And we applied some new analytic techniques to the data, and we were able to identify 3 different types of risk-taking children. One group takes no risks at all. They stop pushing that space bar to blow up the bubble after just 1 or 2 times. They're too scared. They are risk avoidant. Another set of kids push the space bar over and over and make the bubble very, very big and rarely stop before it pops. Those are reckless risk takers. And the third group of children we call adaptive risk takers. They push the space bar. They learn after a little while what they can get away with safely. They're able to tolerate the anxiety knowing that it might risk, that it might burst, and they reach a moderate number of average pushes before they stop, and they earn the most points. Now, it turns out that those 3 different risk-taking groups also differ in their executive functions. So we're now preparing reports for you all, which will identify children who we think, on the basis of these risk-taking test performance and their executive function skills that go with that, might be children you want to look at a little more closely. And the reason? Well, if you're risk avoidant, you're not going to learn as much. There may be reasons why you're risk avoidant that would be good to understand. Maybe you're too anxious about things. And if you're a reckless risk taker, we know that the leading causes of death and illness in adolescents were related to reckless risk taking. And you know that schools invest a lot in preventive interventions, for example, safe driving, safe sex, don't use drugs. But right now, schools do that with a one-size-fits-all program because they don't have a way of identifying children for whom the risk is greater. So this is just an example of how we work at CA, and one of the assessments that your children will be doing, we will be giving you information on. Here shows you, I mentioned before that we had data on thousands of children in each age level. This is just an illustration of that for you to see. On that flanker test of attention, the response time as children get older gets shorter and shorter, so that's improvement when it's going down. The response inhibition in the go-no-go test gets higher and higher, and working memory scores get higher and higher from kindergarten to 8th grade. So this is important for several reasons. One, it shows that these executive function skills are actively developing. There's this age period in elementary and early middle school, and that's the time that we want to intervene to enhance development of these neural systems when they're still actively plastic and developing. And second of all, it gives us more confidence, as it should you, in the validity of our tests, because we show these nice age-related increases.